The 1980s didn't just bring us neon jackets, cassette tapes, and the birth of MTV. For trucking, the decade was nothing short of a revolution. If the 1970s were all about oil shocks and CB radios, the 80s ripped the industry wide open. For decades, the trucking business had been tightly controlled. Rates, routes, and even which companies could haul freight were dictated by government rules. But in 1980, Washington threw the rulebook out the window. Suddenly, thousands of new trucking companies appeared overnight. Big carriers that once dominated had to fight tooth and nail to stay alive. At the same time, fuel prices pushed engineers to rethink how trucks were built. Long square noses gave way to sleeker shapes. Aerodynamics went from nice idea to survival strategy. And drivers began seeing the first flickers of technology that would one day define modern logistics. This is the story of how the 1980s changed trucking forever. And trust me, it's not just about policy, it's about freedom, survival, and chrome still shining on the highway. To understand why deregulation mattered so much, you've got to picture how rigid things were before 1980. For decades, the Interstate Commerce Commission decided who could haul what freight, where, and at what price. If you wanted to run your own company, good luck. You needed government approval, and those licenses were harder to get than Super Bowl tickets. Then came the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, signed by President Jimmy Carter. Overnight, the walls came down. Suddenly, anyone with a truck and ambition could become a carrier. Freight rates were no longer dictated by bureaucrats, but by the free market. The result? Chaos and opportunity. The number of licensed carriers more than doubled within a few years. Independent owner-operators who'd once been locked out suddenly had their shot. But the big legacy carriers, the ones used to cushy regulated rates, now faced brutal competition. Many went under. For drivers, deregulation was a mixed bag. On one hand, there were more jobs than ever. On the other, pay dropped. The union clout that once guaranteed steady wages weakened. Some truckers joked that deregulation gave them more freedom than they ever wanted. Freedom to work longer hours for less money. Still, trucking had broken free of its old cage. The open market had arrived, and it was survival of the fittest on the asphalt. If you're enjoying this dive into trucking history, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more stories from the road ahead, and you won't want to miss what comes next. With deregulation, small outfits popped up everywhere. Some were one-truck operations run by families. Others were scrappy regional fleets that grew fast. Suddenly, customers had more choices than ever. This is when trucking became truly entrepreneurial. Drivers who'd spent years working under big carriers could now hang their own shingle. The saying, "My name on the door," became a badge of pride. You weren't just hauling freight, you were building a legacy, even if it was just with one old Kenworth and a leased trailer. Of course, not all of these new companies made it. Plenty went bankrupt within a year. Some cut corners on maintenance or safety to stay afloat. But others grew into the modern giants we know today. Deregulation may have been brutal, but it cleared the path for innovation and competition that shaped the future of trucking. If deregulation shook the business side of trucking, fuel prices rattled the engineering side. The oil crises of the 1970s hadn't gone away. By the early 80s, diesel was still expensive, and fleets were desperate to save every drop. That's when aerodynamics became the new obsession. Before this, most trucks were built like rolling bricks. Tall, square cabs with flat grills looked great with chrome but wasted fuel. Suddenly, manufacturers started reshaping their rigs to cheat the wind. In 1985, Kenworth introduced the T600A, a truck with a sloped hood and smoother lines. It looked downright alien compared to the long-nosed W900s parked at the truck stops. Some drivers even nicknamed it Anteater. But here's the kicker. It got up to 20% better fuel economy. For fleets battling high diesel costs, that was like striking gold. Soon, every manufacturer followed suit. Aerodynamic fairings, roof caps, and side skirts became common. What started as an experiment became the new normal. Even drivers who hated the look had to admit it saved money. There's an old story about one fleet boss in Texas who refused to buy the T600 because it was ugly. 6 months later, he caved, because his competitors were saving thousands in fuel while he kept paying top dollar at the pump. In trucking, pretty doesn't pay the bills. Aerodynamics do. We tend to think of GPS, satellite tracking, and electronic logs as 21st century inventions. But their seeds were planted in the 1980s. This was when onboard computers first started showing up in big fleets. They weren't fancy by today's standards, just black boxes that recorded mileage, fuel use, and sometimes driver hours. But for managers, it was revolutionary. Suddenly, they had hard data instead of guesswork. Communications also started shifting. CB radios were still king, but satellite tracking made its first appearances. Companies like Qualcomm began experimenting with systems that let dispatchers know where their trucks were in near real time. Drivers were skeptical. After all, part of the appeal of trucking was the freedom to disappear down the highway. Now, Big Brother was watching. Even maintenance started changing. Diagnostic tools could plug into the truck's electronics to pinpoint issues. Instead of guessing what caused a breakdown, mechanics could read codes. It wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of the computer-driven trucks we know today. The 1980s didn't put laptops in every cab, but it pointed the industry in that direction. Trucking was stepping out of the analog age and dipping its toes into digital waters. The 1980s didn't just change the business of trucking, they changed what it felt like to live the life of a trucker. Deregulation opened the doors to thousands of new carriers, and with that came tighter schedules, longer hours, and far more competition on the highways. The easygoing, convoy-friendly vibe of the CB Radio 70s began to fade. Drivers who once had time to roll in groups and chatter on Channel 19 now found themselves racing deadlines, hustling freight faster and cheaper just to stay in the game. Yet trucking culture never disappeared. It simply adapted. Diners, truck stops, and motels across America stayed packed, humming with drivers swapping stories over strong coffee. Music changed too. Instead of relying on scratchy radio signals, drivers now had cassette decks in their cabs. A shoebox full of tapes meant you could control the soundtrack of your run, from Hank Williams Jr. to Def Leppard, depending on your mood. The trucks themselves mirrored the decade's style. Chrome still reigned supreme, but paint schemes went wild neon stripes, bold gradients, and decals that made rigs look like rolling billboards or rock concerts on wheels. It was pure 80s energy, flashing down the interstate. But beneath the color and music was tension. Deregulation meant more rookies took to the road, some with less training and discipline than veterans. Old-timers grumbled about cheap freight cowboys crowding the lanes. And in a sense, they were right. Trucking was no longer an exclusive club. By the mid-80s, anyone with ambition and a rig could join the ride. Looking back, the 1980s didn't just shake up a decade. They rewired the entire trucking industry from the ground up. It was a turning point that permanently changed how freight moved, how companies operated, and even how trucks were designed. Deregulation was the spark. Before 1980, the government controlled almost everything: rates, routes, and who could haul freight. Once the Motor Carrier Act came into play, the floodgates opened. Competition exploded. Giants like Swift, Schneider, and J.B. Hunt took full advantage, carving out empires that are still dominant today. At the same time, thousands of small carriers emerged, many of them family-run businesses. Some disappeared quickly, others survived and thrived, and a surprising number still operate under the same names decades later. Fuel efficiency became another obsession. Rising diesel prices forced manufacturers to rethink truck design. The Kenworth T600, nicknamed the Anteater for its sloped nose, looked strange to traditionalists, but it set a new standard. Suddenly, aerodynamics weren't a gimmick, they were a necessity. Every sleek modern rig on the highway owes something to that bold experiment. Technology, too, began creeping into cabs. The primitive black boxes of the 80s evolved into the GPS trackers, ELDs, and telematics systems that define today's industry. What once seemed like science fiction is now basic equipment. Of course, not all drivers celebrated these changes. Many argue deregulation gutted wages and weakened the brotherhood of the road. But one truth remains. The 1980s didn't just change trucking, they created the trucking world we live in today. So next time you see a modern rig with its smooth curves, satellite antennas, and a small company's logo painted proudly on the door, remember, it all traces back to the 1980s. A decade of deregulation, new technology, and relentless focus on fuel turned trucking into the industry we know today. It was messy, it was controversial, and yes, sometimes it was ugly. But it was also a time of opportunity when the open road became more accessible than ever before. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think deregulation was the best thing that ever happened to trucking? Or did it hurt drivers more than it helped? And if you were around in the 80s, what do you remember most? The Antietam Kenworths, the new tech, or the neon stripes on every trailer? Drop your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this ride through trucking history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the machines and people that keep America moving. Because the story of trucking is the story of America, and this was one of its biggest chapters.